My name is Jerry McGurney. I'm a congressman from California. I'm also a strong advocate for campaign finance reform, and this is our third meeting of the Campaign Finance Reform Caucus. Now, it's a bipartisan caucus. Walter Jones is a co-chair of the caucus, and we are committed to working across the aisle to find a way to reduce the impact of money in Congress. Now, our first meeting, we had the Congressional Research Service was giving a presente, and Sam is here from there this morning. Our second meeting, we have Trevor Potter, an author, a former member of the Federal Election Commission, gave a very enlightening talk. Today we have Lawerence Lessig, special guest. Lawerence has a very interesting history. I want to just sort of make a plug for my proposal. I have a proposal, House Joint Resolution 31, which would eliminate PACs and super PACs, among other things. It's a very strong proposal, but I think in order to get something really passed, we have to work across the aisle, and that's one thing I've learned in Congress. If you want to get something done, you have to work across the aisle if you want to get something really done. So that's why I'm committed to working on a bipartisan basis. Believe it or not, I've had some positive feedback from members even of the Freedom Caucus. So I'm optimistic that we can get something done, but we want to lay the groundwork here in this caucus to do that. I want to introduce our guest tonight, this afternoon, Lawerence Lessig. Now, he is a professor of law and leadership at Harvard University. I'm going to put on my glasses, a little smaller print here. And I'll just read this. Lawerence Lessig is the Roy L. Furman Professor of Law and Leadership at Harvard Law School. Prior to joining Harvard faculty, Lessig was professor at Stanford Law School, where he founded the school's Center for Internet and Society, and the University of Chicago. He clerked for Judge Richard Posner, in the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, and Justice Anton Scalia on the United States Supreme Court. Lessig serves on the board of the AXA Research Fund and on the advisory boards of the Creative Commons and the Sunlight Foundation. He is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Philosophical Association, and has received numerous awards, including the Free Software Foundation's Freedom Award, Fact Case 50 Award, and being named one of the Scientific American's top 50 visionaries. Wow. Professor Lessig holds a BA in economics and a BS in management from the University of Pennsylvania, and an MA in philosophy from Cambridge and a JD from Yale. Professor Lessig has also been a presidential candidate on this issue, and I think that brings a lot to the table. So I really want to welcome Professor Lessig and thank him for coming from Iceland today to meet with us. Thank you, Professor Lessig.
So I'm grateful to be here, not just because the plane made it from Iceland, but I'm grateful to have the chance to speak. I'm a little surprised by the opportunity to speak in this way. When I was invited, I thought I'd never spoken at Congress for more than 5 minutes at a time, and was expecting I would speak for 5 minutes at a time, and then was asked today if I would put together a presentation based on the kinds of presentations I've been making for the last decade about this issue. And so I'm going to do that, and that presentation has been quickly fitted to what I want to suggest here today, and it's a little different from a focus on campaign finance reform alone. So I'm grateful for the chance to present it to you. So I want to start by getting your attention by saying something a little impolitic, but here it goes, because that's my job. At the core of our democracy, there is a hole where the framers envisioned there would be a Congress. A hole, I believe, a failed institution, crippled and corrupted, incapable of doing its job. You could say bankrupt. I don't mean fiscally bankrupt, I mean politically bankrupt. Current confidence in Congress bounces around the margin of error. Now, why is it this confidence has disappeared. For the last 10 years, I've given more than 350 talks around the world about you, about this institution of Congress. And I've come to recognize something pretty important. I've recognized that I actually think very differently about you from how most Americans think about you. I would say from how the vast majority of Americans think about you. The vast majority believe Congress has failed because the members of Congress are bad. But I believe Congress has failed despite the members being great. I have enormous respect for the people who serve in Congress. I believe every one of them comes to this institution with the very best intentions and desires to make this government work. But I believe that they've allowed this institution to fail because they've allowed obvious incentives to develop that will guarantee that the institution will fail. And one more difference between me and what I've discovered most people think about this. I believe you actually can fix this problem, and that it's critical you fix this problem, while Americans believe it's hopeless, that there's nothing that can be done. Okay, when you ask Americans why that is, what they say is the problem is money in politics. That's kind of a cute way of saying that. Politics with the dollar sign there, it's money in politics. But I increasingly think that's a mistake to talk about it like that. It's the wrong level of generality. In my view, the problem here is a problem of representativeness. The problem is this is no longer a representative body in a representative democracy. Not because of money in politics, or maybe not just because of money in politics, but I do think that the problem of money in politics shows the pattern of the problem that affects Congress generally. And that's the pattern I want to introduce today. So, I want to give the problem a name, obscurely. I'm going to call the problem of tweedism. I'm going to introduce it with two examples that I think will be uncontroversial and move to one which most might find at least controversial. The first example comes from a year and a half ago in the country of Hong Kong. You remember extraordinary protests broke out in Hong Kong where students, literally high school students, college students, eventually recruited their parents to show up to protest a law which had been proposed for selecting the chief executive in Hong Kong, the governor. The description of the law was the ultimate aim is the selection of the chief executive by universal suffrage upon nomination by a broadly representative nominating committee in accordance with democratic procedures. So what Hong Kong had done is they'd set up a two-step process. The nominating committee picks the candidates, and then the public gets to vote among the candidates that were selected. The nominating committee was going to be 1,200 people, which out of a population of 7 million means about 0.02% of Hong Kong got to pick the candidates that the rest of Hong Kong got to vote on. Now that number is a very small number, as you can see on the screen right here. If you represented 0.02% against the population of all of Hong Kong, it would look like this. A tiny, tiny fraction selecting the candidates that the public got to vote among. So this nominating committee creates a filter, and the fear of the protesters was that this filter was biased. The 0.02% was dominated by a pro-Beijing business and political elite. 99.98% excluded from this critical first step, with the consequence, obviously, of producing a democracy responsive to China only. Now, it turns out the trick that Hong Kong deployed, this democracy-defeating device, was not invented in Hong Kong, unless Boss Tweed was an ancient Chinese prophet. Because this trick was actually an invention of Tweed. Tweed famously said, I don't care who does the electing, as long as I get to do the nominating. So Tweed's theory was so long as he had control over the process of selecting the candidates, that's all the control he needed. Because the candidates knew they had to keep him happy, and happy they kept him. This genius technique for defeating the objective of democracy I want to call Tweedism. And Tweedism is any two-stage process, let's say, where an unrepresented few get to select, indirectly or directly, the candidates that the rest get to vote among, and the consequence of Tweedism, obviously, is to produce a system responsive to tweeds only. Now, this technique was not practiced in America exclusively in New York. Think about Texas in 1923. Texas passed a law in 1923. It said only whites could vote in the Democratic primary, the all-white primary, which Texas and other states in the South practiced, assured that the participation in the critical first stage in the only party that mattered would be exclusive to whites, producing a two-stage process where 16% of the population was excluded from that critical first stage, with the consequence, obviously, of producing a democracy responsive to whites only. So this technique is general, it's universal across the world and across our history, and these cases I've given you of this technique are clear. This is a brilliant system for defeating the objectives of democracy by perverting this first stage through this system of unrepresentative selection. Well, if those cases are clear, this case should be clear too. We take it for granted in America that campaigns will be privately funded. But funding is its own context. Funding is its own primary. It takes time. Academics measuring the time that you spend raising money say that it takes anywhere between 30 and 70% of your time, depending on the district, depending on the year, dialing for dollars, calling people from across the country to raise the money you need to survive. B.F. Skinner gave us this image of the Skinner box, where any animal could learn which buttons it needed to push to get the sustenance it needs to survive. I'm sure this begins to feel like your life in Congress as you learn which buttons you need to push in order to get the sustenance you need to survive. There is no doubt psychologically this has an effect. Members develop a sixth sense, a constant awareness about how what you do affects your ability to raise money. Become the words of the X-Files shapeshifters, as you constantly adjust your views in light of what you know might help you to raise money, not on the issues 1 to 10, but on issues 11 to 1,000, where neither you nor the public necessarily knows how this is having an effect. Leslie Byrne, Democrat from Virginia, describes it. When she came to Congress, she was told by a colleague, quote, "Always lean to the green." And to clarify, she went on, he was not an environmentalist. So the point is, this is a primary too. It's the money primary, not a white primary, but a green primary. It's the first stage in a multi-stage process to select the candidates who get to be elected by the public. To run in the voting elections, you're going to have to do very well in this green-back primary. So that raises the question, who are these funders? Now, most people focus on the biggest funders, and the biggest funders are huge funders. So in the last 2014, the top 100 gave as much as the bottom 4.75 million. In the presidential election cycle, the first part of the cycle, a tiny number, less than 150, had given half the money that had been contributed. The same with super PACs. 50 people have given half the amount that had been contributed to super PACs. These are the biggest funders, and of course that creates in the public's mind an extraordinary image of power or influence. But I don't think that's actually the important class to think about. I think we should think about the relevant funders. The people who give enough money to matter in the process of raising money, who give enough so that when you're thinking of who to call or what to say to that person, you're worried about what that person might think. What is the number that makes that person relevant in the fundraising game? Well, let's just be arbitrary about it. Let's take $5,200, the maximum amount should be given in 2014, to one candidate in 2 election cycles. If you looked at 2014, $5,200, turns out 57,874 Americans gave the equivalent of $5,200 or more in that election cycle. $57,874. Which for the math whizzes in the audience, you know means that 0.02% of America were the relevant funders in this first stage of selecting the candidates who are going to be able to run in that election cycle. 0.02%, this tiny fraction of the 1%, we could say a Chinese fraction of the 1% dominating the first stage, with the consequence, obviously, of producing a democracy responsive to the funders only. It's a Princeton study, which is a Harvard professor I'm not allowed to refer to, so I'll put it off the stage really quickly, by Martin Gillens and Ben Page. I'm sure it's very familiar, especially to people on this committee. The largest empirical study in the history of political science, relating the actual decisions of our government to the attitudes of the economic elites, organized interest groups, and then the average voter. And what they find is a very strong relationship between the economic elite and what our government actually does. What this is saying is the percentage of the elite who support something goes from 0 to 100%. The probability of it being passed goes up. That's what you would think. The more who support something, the more likely it is it gets passed. Same thing with organized interest groups. The more who support the idea, the more likely it is that it will be passed. But here's the graph for the average citizens. It's a flat line, literally and figuratively. What this is saying is, it doesn't matter the percentage of average citizens who support something. That doesn't change the probability of that proposal being enacted. As they put it in English, when the preferences of the economic elites and the stands of organized interest groups are controlled for, the preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact on public policy in a democracy. Right, this is the image we teach our children about what this democracy is supposed to be like. We the citizens driving the bus. But this increasingly is the reality of this democracy. The steering wheel has become detached because we no longer have the relationship a representative democracy promised between what the average citizen wants and what our government does. This is a consequence of what I've called tweedism. What tweedism is, in one respect, in the respect you experience, is it is first humiliating. Humiliating of you. Representatives of the most powerful democracy in the world living your life like underpaid telemarketers. It's demeaning. Demeaning of you. It's demeaning of your office. It's demeaning of this democracy. And embarrassing when you go around the world and people around the world reflect on the way this democracy funds its campaigns. And I think more of this House needs to become embarrassed by the demeaning character of the way we fund campaigns. But it is also corruption. Now, I don't mean it's corruption of members. I'm not predicating that word of members. Again, as I said, I believe members of Congress, members of current Congress, are the cleanest members of Congress in the history of Congress. I'm not talking about bribery or anybody violating any ethics rule or any legal rule. It's not corrupting of members, it's corrupting of the system. The system. We are, as our framers said, a republic. By a republic, they said we would be a, quote, representative democracy. And by a representative democracy, they meant, as Madison described in Federalist 52, a government that would have a branch that ought to be dependent on the people alone. An exclusive dependency on the people. But this is not a republic dependent on the people alone. It's not quite alone because it's the people and the funders of campaigns. And the views of the funders of campaigns are not the views of the people. So this additional dependence, in this very technical but important institutional sense, corrupts the institution of representative democracy, even if every member is as pure and honest and committed to the public good as they possibly could be. It is corruption even if it doesn't corrupt the voter. People look at this recent presidential election cycle and they point to cases like Jeb Bush. And they say he raises $100 million and it had no effect. So this money was wasted, so money doesn't matter. But this argument misses the point The corruption is not in the spending of the money. It's not like spending the money is corrupting the public. The corruption is in the fundraising. It is in the process of raising the money that this corruption has its effect. It's not the people who are corrupted, it's the process that the politicians must live within. And this corruption has consequences. First, it helps polarize Congress, because there's a psychology to this fundraising. As Senator Murphy puts it, they estimate in their office that money raised from negative emails to their list about Republicans is twice as much as money raised from positive emails about the Democrats. And that's not because of Democrats and Republicans, it's because the mechanism of fundraising is always going to flourish the more fear and anger you can put into the system, and that's what negative fundraising does. Senator Manchin describes this. Money has infiltrated and driven us apart. The process of this fundraising weakens the capacity of the institution to function by driving members further apart. That's number one. Number two, it helps make an unrepresentative Congress. This is the point of the Gillens and Page study, that it is driving Congress not to be responsive to the people, but allowing Congress to be responsive to some entity, not the people. And number three, it is producing distracted political elites. Political elites distracted from what the public cares about, which yields an angry and frustrated democracy. They are distracted by this process of raising money. And this is true of Democrats and Republicans both. So Republicans, Paul Krugman had this piece last fall about Republicans against retirement. What he says in the piece is, what's puzzling about the renewed Republican assault on Social Security is that it looks like it's bad politics as well as bad policy. Americans love Social Security. So why are the candidates for president at least pretending to share that sentiment? The answer is that the candidates realized they needed to be raising their money not from the average voter, but from those who were providing big money in that election cycle, and those people don't like Social Security as it is, driving the candidates away from the public, or as he had another article, Cranks on Top. In short, Mr. Rubio is peddling crank in economics. What's interesting, however, is why. You see, he's not pandering to ignorant voters, he's pandering to an ignorant elite. So when Mr. Rubio genuflects at the altar of supply-side economics and hard money, he isn't telling ordinary Republicans what they want to hear. By and large, the party's base couldn't care less. He is instead pandering to the party's elite, consisting mainly of big donors and the network of apparatchiks at think tanks, media organizations, and so on. So the point is, this influence drives the party away from what the base of the party cares about. And I suggest the result of that primary season bears this argument out, because the frustration that manifested itself in the selection of Mr. Trump is exactly consistent with that account. But it's true of Democrats too. Many people on the Democratic side were frustrated and concerned by the affiliation between Secretary Clinton and these big money interests, because it made them think that her focus was not on the interests of the ordinary Democrats, but on interests that would be more clearly tied to money. In both cases, what this practice does is alienate the base, making the political context ripe for the rise of people like Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. That's the consequence of what I call tweedism. Okay. Tweedism is my first point. Here's the second. The pathologies I've described are a byproduct of unrepresentativeness, of a system that is unrepresentative. Unrepresentativeness caused not just by money in politics, but caused also by other flaws in the system. So here are two obvious ones. One, let's call safe seat gerrymanderingism or Jerryism. So you know this very well. Christopher Ingram's great article in the Post describes this practice of crafting districts to make them safe against attack, crimes against geography. This practice, of course, produces a house which is incredibly distorted in the way it represents America. So 435 seats at most, this is certainly an exaggeration, 90 are competitive, which means that 89 million Americans live in seats where their views aren't fully represented because they could never matter to their representative because they are the minority in a safe majority seat. So whether that's Democrats in safe Republican seats or Republicans in safe Democratic seats, what this means is the way we craft districts produces unrepresented citizens, close to 90 million, if you assume that there are even as many as 90 competitive seats. But it's also caused by the way we've allowed an unequal freedom to vote to develop. The Brennan Center had a fantastic study of the 2014 election cycle, pointing to waiting times across the United States, finding that if you look across the United States, 10 million Americans had to wait more than 30 minutes to vote. Now you might think, well, what's 30 minutes to vote? And of course, if you're a middle-class person with childcare and a cell phone, 30 minutes doesn't mean much. It would be okay to say you're going to wait 30 minutes to vote. But for other people who don't have childcare, who have the demands of maybe one or two different jobs on them, this is effectively, as the former Attorney General put it, a poll tax that many working Americans just simply cannot afford. And the consequence, once again, is inequality in the system of representation that we've allowed to develop. All three of these examples defeat the idea of representative democracy and enable the dysfunction and cronyism that produce the angry and frustrated citizens that we see across America today. Okay, number three, how can we solve this problem? Well, technically, it's not hard. I'm convinced, even without touching the Constitution, which I'm happy to talk about in questions, I think the Supreme Court is going to fix the biggest problem with the Constitution. And so, putting that aside, most of this problem, 90% of the problem, could be fixed by a statute. And increasingly, we're seeing people talk about a package of reform that could fix this problem. So I described something I call the Citizen Equality Act that had three parts: citizen-funded campaigns, meaning bottom-up public funding, a mix between vouchers and matching funds. My idea originally was $50 vouchers that every voter would get. Richard Painter, who was George Bush's ethics czar, a Republican now teaching in Minnesota, has advanced this idea of a $200 voucher. The American Anti-Corruption Act has a voucher proposal in it. John Sarbanes' Government by the People Act has a pilot program for vouchers, plus a very aggressive matching fund proposal. All of these ideas would radically change the funders' power in our political system, because it would change the business model of funding. It would no longer make sense to spend your time raising money from the very few. You would increasingly raise your time from the very many. And this is, in my view, the most important change that we need to bring about as soon as possible. But number two, the Citizen Equality Act talked about ways to achieve equal representation. And a point that most people forget is that Congress could fix this problem with the power the Constitution gives it tomorrow. Fair Vote and Michael Goldman in Unlock Congress described proposals exercising Congress's Article 1, Section 4 power to basically create multi-member district with ranked choice voting to effectively bring about proportional representation in the House, which, if we achieved something like proportional representation, would mean the House would begin to express the diversity of America in a way that right now it doesn't begin to express the diversity because of the extremes that concentrate in the way we've allowed gerrymandering to proceed. Number three, the Equal Freedom to Vote component basically combines the Voting Rights Advancement Act and the Democracy Day proposals of Bernie Sanders to make it easier for people to vote, equally easy for people to vote. Now, similar packages have been advanced by others. Steny Hoyer's proposal, a fantastic combination of package that he proposed 2 months ago, includes public funding and gerrymandering and enable voting the way the Citizen Equality Act does, but he also adds a component which adds technical infrastructure to advance the capacity of people to engage with their government. And John Sarbanes' By the People legislative package has put together a set of proposals beyond public voting public funding to include public funding enabling voters as well as other disclosure packages to increase the confidence people have in their government. But the point is, whatever the package is, we should be clear about the principle the package is advancing. What is the point of the reform? And rather than talking in the abstract about money and politics, I think we should talk instead about the fundamental value as equality, the equality of equal representation, an equality which has been at the core of our principles and our tradition since the beginning when we were given a representative democracy. So in my view, the challenge is not the technical challenge, what exactly the law would look like. I think it's easy to figure out what the components must be to achieve this equality. The challenge is political. Because who is it in our system who's going to exercise the political will to bring about this change? What entity? The Supreme Court can't do it. Turns out, I think the president just will never have sufficient incentives to do it, because if you take on Congress as the president, you create an opposition that could lead to the failure of your presidency. The question is whether Congress could build in itself the will to do it. And of course, it's not yet been courageous enough, in my view, to end what seems to me like this humiliation of the current system. So here's an idea that I want to close with. To provide a mechanism that might begin to build will inside Congress to actually address and resolve this problem. The idea is to, in a certain way, ask the people. So here's the plan. Imagine Congress passes a law that establishes something like a citizen jury, but a big citizen jury. So I'm imagining 1,000 people randomly selected and represented. And you take these 1,000 randomly selected represented citizens and we basically hire them. We say we're going to hire you for 2 weeks. We're going to pay you twice whatever you're being paid right now. And we're going to give protection for your job. So this will not hurt. We're going to hire you, gather them all in one place, give them the information they need, all sides in the debate about reforming the integrity of the electoral process, then give them a chance to deliberate. This is tracking the model Jim Fishkin has proposed, what he calls deliberative polls. But the point is, this is a process which by its design is as representative as it could be, and by giving citizens a chance to understand and deliberate about these proposals, gives them a chance to say something informed and meaningful. And then once they do that and they propose whatever they propose, then you follow up by listening to them and introducing their work at least to give Congress a chance to debate it. And my sense, following how deliberative polls work, is that what they produce will actually be incredibly sensible to respond to exactly these problems, but bracketed from the political fights that make it so hard for Congress to act in this particular context. And then the hope is that you could act to end, again, I think it's a humiliation that is your life, the embarrassment that is our representative democracy. Okay, let me end with just one point. One more point. So, when I started this project a decade ago, my view was like most Americans. And this decade has taught me, if nothing else, that we have to find a way to convince most Americans that there's a reason to believe in the people who are serving in Congress and the goodwill that they bring to the project, whether Republicans or Democrats. And that's the critical missing trust to make government function. This is a crisis of the confidence in our democracy. The framers of our Constitution thought you were the crown jewel of what they had built. They put Article 1 as describing Congress. And they thought that what they had built in a representative democracy would be much safer, much more robust, much more loved than the other institutions. But of course, the public likes the court, and the public likes the president, depending on which party he or she happens to be, much more than Congress. My view is fixing Congress is the most important problem. And by fixing Congress, I don't mean fixing you. I mean fixing the institution so the public has a reason to trust it again. And if the public had a reason to trust it, then the problems we face as a nation could be addressed by you with the confidence of the people behind it. So I'm happy to take your questions or your abuse, because I've been a little abusive to you. I understand, but I appreciate you giving me the opportunity.
Thank you, Professor. I'm going to try and moderate the questions by asking the first question, if you don't mind. There's a lot of questions that I have, but the one that strikes me about the voucher idea is that if you go to a voucher program, it just puts more money into the system. And that means that I think the big contributors would be willing and able to pony up to beat that. And so I think that's one of my concerns. And you mentioned that it's not how the money is spent, and there's a certain truth to that. But just bringing more money into the system isn't going to. I don't think it will do any good.
Well, so the voucher proposals are a little bit different. The proposal that I've offered says that if you take vouchers, you're not going to take other kinds of contributions. You're not going to take contributions larger than, let's say, $100. So what it's doing is substituting the kind of money that's in the system. Now, you're right. For people who don't opt into the system, there will still be the other money in the system. But if you get the numbers right, the number of people who opt in should be very high. So in Connecticut, when they adopted not the voucher program, but the small dollar public funding program, 78% of the elected representatives opted into the system in the first year. And that number has remained high, and the same thing in Maine, because the numbers made sense for members not to waste their time raising money at cocktail parties, but instead reaching out to voters and doing the work of what a representative should be. So I'm not asserting that I know my numbers are right. What I'm saying is we should be able to figure out what the right number is. And that's what I think is great of John Sarbanes' proposal, is that he has a pilot program for vouchers to see what in fact it does. We should be able to look at the actual effect in the different contexts in which we played with small dollar public funding, whether it's vouchers or matching funds, and get the numbers so that people have a reason to opt into this way of funding as opposed to the other. Because again, my real view is the problem is the effect the fundraising has on the member. We can complain in lots of different ways about the problems about the way the money is actually spent.
Okay. Brendan?
Yeah, Brendan Boyle, PA 13. Thank you for this. I appreciate Jerry letting me know on the House floor yesterday, because to me this is the most important issue, because it's the one issue that actually affects every other single issue. But I wanted to ask, actually, before I have to rush off the call time, I wanted to ask, or actually make a comment and then ask a question. The first comment is, and I say this when I'm doing town halls in my district in suburban Philadelphia, that I was encouraged by the fact that both Trump and Sanders supporters agree on this point about fundamentally changing our campaign finance system. In those town halls, I also point out that this is not new. We had a publicly funded campaign finance system at the presidential level from 1976 all the way through to when it broke down right around 2004, 2008. So the fact is we've already done this. The post-Watergate reforms did have the presidential system. Unfortunately, it just didn't keep pace with the checkoff box. But my question is, though, I have my own proposal that we're about to drop. I'm co-sponsor on every one of the bills that you mentioned. I tend to look at it, though, is that we focus a lot of time on the supply side of the equation, and maybe a different way of attacking it would be on the demand side. So the good news is, unlike previous eras, when we're raising all this money, it's not to go into our pockets. It's to turn around and spend on the campaigns. 85% of the dollars I spent on my campaign to get elected in one of the most expensive primaries in the country was on TV time, was to buy TV ads. So my proposal actually deals with free TV time for candidates who qualify, and there would be objective measures for qualification. If you solve the problem of free advertising or equalized advertising, you've now just addressed 85% of my need to raise money it's suddenly now not that much of a concern and not that much of a deal to me. So I was curious what you think about that.
Well, first, with respect to the comments, it is the really fundamental fact about this election cycle that what unites people on the left and the right is a frustration with the current system.
I actually said it on the House floor.
Yeah, probably where I heard it. You know, in Vermont, in New Hampshire, in the first primary, 38% of New Hampshire voters are undeclared. They declare themselves on election day which party they want to vote in based on which they're more interested in want to vote in. And what the poll showed is that the hardest choice they were making was whether to support Sanders or Trump. And to somebody who's not thinking about this fundamental frustration with the corruption of the system, this is bizarre, because those are two radically different people. But from this perspective, they're the same. What they both were talking about was the need to fundamentally change the system. And frankly, as a Democrat, who desperately wants to see Hillary Clinton elected, what I fear is that there's not enough of a recognition in this campaign about that frustration to respond to the people who have shown skepticism because of this concern that business as usual will continue. But as to this demand-supply side point, you're absolutely right. If you look across other countries, mature democracies, and look at how they solve the system, they solve the problem by managing both the demand and the supply side. So France bans television ads except for 30 minutes, which is given for free to all the parties. And other countries have similar ways to control the length and time of elections. Britain, until they went to the regular 5-year period, of course, had short elections because nobody knew when the election was. You call an election 6 weeks from then, that means the campaign is 6 weeks. The cost of elections is much lower. The challenge that we face, that you face, is that the Supreme Court has made it incredibly difficult to regulate the demand side. And even the precedent on which the court seemed to signal we could regulate the cost of television, I think is very shaky in the world of cable television and the world of the internet. Because the premise of that decision, the Red Line decision, was that this was public airwaves that was being allocated, and so we could condition all sorts of requirements on access to those public airwaves. But the court recently, the Denver case, has been quite clear that it's a different rule when you're talking about cable infrastructure that's been built privately, and certainly the internet would be the same space. So I'm not actually sure there's the constitutional power to do much with that. Now, we could talk about amending the Constitution, and of course that's what lots of people are talking about, and I think that's an important step to take. But though I'm deeply committed to reform, I'm deeply concerned about the difficulty of amending the First Amendment in a way that doesn't have unintended consequences that could be quite disastrous. So I think we can afford public funding in that. There's, the cost of the voucher program that I described is about $1.7 billion a year. So that's a lot of money until you look at, for example, Cato Institute's estimate of the amount of corporate welfare in the budget, which is $100 billion every year. So if you could reduce your corporate welfare by 10% because you weren't dependent on corporate money to fund your campaigns, you could fund public funding 2.5 times over. So it's not expensive relative to what you spend money on. And rather, in my view, rather than opening up the question of how to amend the First Amendment to give us what we want here, the cheaper, direct thing we can do tomorrow is to make it so people like you
unless just one point, unless you do what other states and municipalities have done, and that is an opt-in system rather than a compulsory. Yeah. Well, that would get around the constitutional.
Right. And the opt-in system, right, and that's what the presidential public funding did. And then one final point about that. People often will make the argument, well, hasn't this election cycle shown you public funding is not necessary? Because look, we had Bernie Sanders and we had Donald Trump, neither of whom depended on big money to get where they got. And I actually think the presidency is very different. And my concern is Congress, not the presidency. But it is important to remember that even though you can have people like Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump without relying on big money, it doesn't change. There's a radical change in the behavior of the president. So every president between Nixon and Obama was publicly funded. When Ronald Reagan, who benefited from public funding more than anybody else, he ran 3 national campaigns in the public eye and took more money than anybody did. When he ran for re-election in 1984, he attended 8 fundraisers. When Barack Obama ran for re-election, he attended 228 fundraisers. So you're just saying, how do you serve as President of the United States and attend 220 Congresses? And the answer is you spend all your time talking, not to average Americans, but you're talking to rich.
First, I'd like to recognize my co-chair, Walter Jones. Walter's been a very big advocate. Did you want to say a few words, Walter?
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. I have been here 22 years, and the only person here that has been here longer is Marcy Kaplan from Ohio. And we have had many, many conversations about the influence of money on policy. It has gotten worse in the 20 years, and not totally because of, but the influence of Citizens United has changed the debate and raised it to a different level as far as the influence of money. I have said many times, and I appreciate everybody's effort. I'm on several Democratic bills as the only Republican. Maybe Richard Hanna, who's here today, who did the national ad against Donald Trump, by the way, in case you didn't know that. But I think he's right, but that's beside the point. The only way this is ever going to happen as it relates to the Congress is through a scandal. And I have said in civic clubs in my district, the 3rd District of North Carolina, the only way we're going to get meaningful reform of campaign issues is to have members of Congress carry down the steps of the White House in handcuffs in a waiting blue police car with a blue light going around. Because neither party wants to change the system at the highest level. I'm not talking about the people here today, but at the highest level. And if there's a book you have not read, I would suggest, I know you're a very learned man and I respect that, called Extortion by Peter Schweitzer. And it talks about and gives examples of policy, of bills that get to the floor because of somebody either in the Democratic Party or the Republican Party having fundraisers and bringing groups in that have an interest in what gets to the floor. And I hate to be so pessimistic, but I've been here 20 years, and we have bitched and complained about this system for so long, and that's why Jerry deserves so much credit to put this together and you being here today. But it's got to be that the very leaders of the parties will take this, and I don't think they will unless it's a scandal.
Well, what worries me about that, if it's true, is that you don't need to engage in scandalous behavior under this system, right? This system is all out in the open. Everything everybody's doing is out in the open. It's not like the old days, like Nixon, where you would bring $200,000 in cash into the White House in order to buy milk policy, right? What happens here is legal. And the Supreme Court's decision in the Donald case means that 99% of what you're talking about is legal. There's no crime here. And if what you need is crime to get change, then I'm afraid we're not going to get change. Now, my view is, this is a scandal. The People's House. This is political bankruptcy. This is a bankrupt institution. Now, what the leaders, I think, need to do is to recognize America can't go on without a representative body that can function. It can't go on. It can't do the work. I mean, the Harvard study from the business school that just came out last week said the #1 economic challenge we face as a nation comes from the inability of our government to govern, to address fundamental questions. Now, all of you at some point, I think, recognize that. I've never met a member of Congress who doesn't in some sense recognize that. But also I recognize the political pressure that makes it so hard for you to act, which is why I was suggesting something like what FDR said. And people came to him and told him he needed to do something. He said, I hear you, and I agree with you. Now you have to make me do it. What they meant is you have to go out in the public and make me do it. And so what I'm suggesting when I say you get something like a citizen's jury is you begin to support activities that creates a public recognition of the need for you to do something. And then, what are you going to do? How are you going to resist it? And sometimes I think this public will goes too far. You look at Brexit. There, a simple majority vote of a minority of the population is going to lead them to basically put a gun to their heads and pull a trigger. But because they believe in the public will so strongly, they will not stop from doing that. I'd like a fraction of that pressure available here by getting something that people could say really is a mandate for you to actually step up and do something. Now, you've been in this fight longer than I have. no doubt. And I will confess, in many, many years, I'm very skeptical that there's anything that can be done. But what I know is that if we don't do something, this government fails. And so we've got to try, regardless of whether we think it's possible, we've got to try every single thing we can. So I'm trying to suggest one more weapon in the arsenal to create the pressure that I don't think the president is going to create, I don't think the court can create, and I understand internally why you find it so hard to actually do this.
Marcy.
Thank you for your work, and I want to thank Jim and Walter for pursuing this path. I didn't catch the first part of your presentation, but you were very lucid, and thank you. I like the idea of mobilization. That's how we do things in this country. Whether it's Rotary or whether it's Congress, we have to mobilize. And I like the idea of a citizens' jury. I like the idea of convening. You bring attention to an issue. I'd like to just let people know, yesterday I ran into one of our former colleagues who is with the former members caucus. There is such a thing. And he told me there are 150 former members, both Republican and Democrat, who care about this issue. And they have a working group. And I just wanted to put that out there because this man is quite intelligent. He was a very good member. And the possibility of linking your idea with that group that understands well what happens inside here, and there will be others, and then taking that out to city councils and local communities, county commissioners, and so forth, and getting them to pass resolutions. This builds momentum around the country. I personally have a couple bills that I put in the hopper. One is a constitutional amendment that Lawerence Tribe helped us draft, actually. I did that because I wanted a mobilization effort, and I thought a constitutional amendment that was easily understood would be one way to do that. But there are probably other ways. But I really like your idea of mobilization. I wish this session were being recorded by C-SPAN, but it's a working session, and we should follow on with something like that. So there's this continuing effort to focus on this. I will also put this fact on the table, which I did not know until yesterday. We were talking about when did Congress really change? And one intelligent person who's worked in this community in Washington for 40 years said it began to change in the early 1980s when a member of Congress, whose name I will not state, decided to leave his committee and go to work for a major lobby for a whole lot of money. And you can just see the acceleration of that trend, and then what's happened since. So I'm here today because I want to participate in such a mobilization effort, and thank you for giving us fodder for thought on that.
I appreciate that. Jim Cooper, who was here earlier, I think has noted the same point about when things began to change. And he very crisply describes the problem as Capitol Hill becoming, quote, a farm league for K Street. And so the idea is that if there are members who are thinking, what's my life after Capitol Hill going to look like, and lobbying against that future, that increases the resistance to changing the system right now. And I think the only way to get over that is exactly what you're talking about, building the outside mobilization.
And I think Bernie Sanders, whatever his mailing list is, he is a weapon in this war, a significant one.
Yeah. And I think he did an extraordinary public service. I wish he had done more to explain to the people what in fact we could do. I think he spent so much energy attacking Hillary Clinton and not enough of his energy showing the public that there's actually something we can do. And there have been many groups. I see represented from Every Voice here, who's been working on this issue forever, has been working hard to build this movement out in the public, and we just need to bring the members and this movement together.
We need to wrap it up, but I'd like to give the two remaining members a chance to have any questions or comments. John?
Yeah.
And then
I don't have a question, Larry. I just want to thank you for, if this is a movement, and I believe it is, to reform our politics, and influence of big money, you are the intellectual underpinning of the movement, starting with your book, Republic Lost, and you are one of the leaders of the movement, and I thank you for it.
Richard?
I've been here 6 years. I've never been in politics. Before that, I always had an interest in public policy. And what I've noticed, and I apologize, I was late to this meeting, most of another one, is that, and I think you probably talked about this somewhat, that part of the problem that needs to be fixed is gerrymandering. And that the ugly reality of gerrymandering is that, as you know, what it does, the members that it actually sought to protect, and it does, are actually being outflanked to the right and to the left. So the very thing that they sought to do, which was protect their seats, has made them unsafe. And so a lot of the money you see coming in is actually, kind of in a strange way, coming out against those members who might normally want to be more centrist, and of course that's what gerrymandering has caused. And the pragmatic middle of this place is reduced to a handful of people.
You're absolutely right.
And that's why I'm not going to be here next year, is because of that. It's just not a productive place for a guy my age to spend time and feel good about it, to be blunt. And so I think what I agree completely about the money, but I also believe that it's more than one problem, and it's layers of problems that have caused kind of unintended consequences. And then there's the other reality of this place is that it was never intended to be a lifelong job, 10, 20, 30 years. And so that if you imagine somebody coming here in their 40s and they don't have an alternative career and not independently wealthy, they wind up kind of becoming, with all due respect, kind of a function of the constituency that sent them there that was badly gerrymandered so that they wind up representing only those people who show up in a primary. So the primaries are essentially the general election. And thank you for being here.
That's exactly right. I mean, that's why I think the essential change is three. Number one, changing the way we raise money. Number two, fixing the gerrymandering problem. Number three, ending the voter suppression. But the gerrymandering one, you're exactly right about the unintended consequence of that gerrymandering. There's a fantastic book which is embarrassing to talk about. I was speaking at the University of Dayton last night, which is a Catholic university, and I had to refer to this book, the title, which is Rat Fucking, which is not the sort of figure you'd like to have to talk about, but it's the story of how technology has radically increased the power of the gerrymanderers to produce these districts where a minority vote can produce a majority seat. So Pennsylvania and Ohio are perfect cases where more people vote Democratic, but there's a significant majority of Republican representatives because of the way the gerrymandering works. And his point, Dave Daley's point in his book is the Democrats, for the first time, have an almost life and death reason to be deeply concerned about gerrymandering. Before this recent cycle, it seemed to benefit both parties. But now they've been so outgunned by the way the representative of the houses of the states have been aligned, that the ability of the party to continue to exist as a potentially majority party has been decimated by this. Which is why I think the proposals by groups like Fair Vote for Congress addressing the problem of gerrymandering, rather than relying on the states to fix it directly, is so important. The Constitution explicitly says, Article 1, Section 4, the states will set the rules unless Congress decides to set them themselves. And so you can decide that the way it's been done has produced a Congress that is not representative of the American people. That's the core idea. And therefore you need to step in and make it representative.
Well, the Supreme Court suggested that in Citizens United, right? I mean, that was their defense of themselves.
Yes.
This is where we are, this is up to your fix. And there's no mutually assured destruction, depending on where you are. And nobody's willing to disarm.
Well, we need to wrap it up. I really appreciate your time, Professor Lessig, and I just want to say there's so many issues that people are concerned about, whether it's gun violence, or whether it's immigration reform, or whether it's climate change, or the distribution of wealth. People are focused on those issues, but the overlying problem is campaign finance reform. And until we can get that under control one way or another, we're not going to be able to address those issues. So we need to mobilize people about those issues around this one. So again, thank you very much for coming.